I can still see some of you. The burning question originally on your screens. Wow, what's that?
I don't know. It's so maybe Ashley, maybe it's the I don't know what that happened. Okay, there you go.
we go.
Okay. Yeah. Mystic images from
Yeah.
outer space.
Right.
So the burning question is this: is American society falling apart? Now, I still can see a few of you, but let's play a little virtual game. If you think that American society is falling apart, signify by raising your virtual hand. Okay. With my mystic powers, I can see that 70.2% of you think that the answer is yes. I can say that with some assurance because I spend most of my time rolling around in data. I've read about a dozen polls in the past some years, indicating that somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of Americans think the answer is yes, that we are falling apart. On this theme, what got me on the topic, years ago, I was spending an afternoon in a brick and mortar building stuffed with actual tomes, books. This was a mystic place that I described to my students. It was called a bookstore. Now, in this crowd, we all actually remember such places, pre-Amazon. So I'm wandering through the place. It was a Borders, if you must know. And in a special display, I saw a big, fat, glossy book called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. Bowling Alone, a New York Times bestseller, was written by a Harvard political scientist, which means there were 2 strikes against him in my mind. But I picked this book up. On the cover was a forlorn-looking individual holding a bowling ball. From the book jacket, I deduced that Bowling Alone was a brilliant title. The idea was this: more Americans than ever are bowling, which parenthetically is a commentary on the question, is American society falling apart? We'll put that aside. Now, I think bowling is hilarious. But anyway, the title was based on the fact that more Americans are bowling, but fewer Americans than ever are members of bowling teams. That title was emblematic of the theme of the book. The book argued that Americans are literally withdrawing from each other. We are socializing less. We are voting less. We are less likely to attend PTA meetings, go to churches. That was the theme. I popped the book open, expecting a lot of fascinating anecdotes which do not impress a sociologist. We're impressed by data. And it wasn't what I expected. Usually the sociology section of even a good bookstore is full of pop material on serial killers, folk dancing. No, this was a real sociology book with real data. Nevertheless, I was convinced that his argument, which was simple, too simple, is that American society is coming apart at the seams. But what it forced me to do is to take seriously the question. How do you answer this question in a way that isn't just a bunch of people's opinions? And to answer the question, you've got to consider the central subject, American society. I did that. And that leads me to us and to now, and to me telling you what this presentation will not be about. We're not going to talk about the institutional superstructure of America. We're not going to talk about constitutional democracy. We're not going to talk about our capitalist economy. I want to talk about the American society that isn't those skeletal structures, it's the guts. It's where you and I live. So, my subject, picking up this book led to such a personal sickness that I've ended up writing 2 books of my own in partial response to Bowling Alone. My subject is social capital. I'm sure you've heard the term. My pedantic definition is social structures that we build and maintain to seek the things we value. So, to answer the burning question, I built a model of social capital, which is now burning its way into your brains on screen. Those 4 zones represent the 4 major areas of social capital that are the everyday reality of American society, by which I mean your life and my life. In case you haven't seen it yet, another thing this presentation will not be about is politics. Frankly, don't we get enough of that? This is about what we are doing in America when the cable TV is off. So let me break it down for you, and then we can get to actually answering the question with real data. Obviously, any definition of social capital, any way of looking at what's really important about life in American society, family is one of the major zones of social capital. It's not so simple, though, defining it. In fact, it's kind of a political minefield, and I said I want to avoid that. So, in the presentation and in my books, I start with marriage. Right? One of the things that made me take Putnam's question seriously is a fact I stumbled upon when I first started to look at this topic. All the data I'm going to present to you today come from a source called the General Social Survey. I'm a good Catholic boy. I almost bowed my head when I said that. The General Social Survey is the state of the art when it comes to survey research in America. Now, I know in the past few elections, there have been some aspersions cast on surveys, whether you can believe them. Look at me. I'm sincere. You can believe the General Social Survey. The data that we see are accurate within 2 to 3%. So, I look at the General Social Survey for the first time. Oh, I should tell you, the General Social Survey has been conducted annually or biannually since 1972. 1972 is an important date in human history. 1972 is when the GSS not only originated, 1972 is when Brian graduated from college and was married. Okay, so we have the track going from 1972 right up to the latest data that was conducted in 2020. Marriage in America. In 1972, 72% of American adults, this is only adults, were married. Easy to remember, 1972, 72%. In 2020, that number, imaginary drum roll, was 43%. We went from 72% of all adults being married in the early 70s. We're way below 50% in contemporary American life. This created a sinking feeling that perhaps Putnam was capturing part of the truth. We refer to family, colloquially, as the building block of society, right? You know, everybody thinks marriage is important to however you define society. And we see that there has been a substantial slippage in Americans' commitment to this institution. Now, part of it, you all know, is that people get married later. When I got married, maybe this was true for many of you, I was right out of college. I was 22. My wife was 21. When I say those numbers in class, my students gasp. They can't believe it. Those were the averages, average male 22, average female 21 back in the early 70s, no longer true. Now the average male is pushing 30, the average female somewhere 26 to 27. But it's much worse than that. Part of the reason for the drop in the overall percentage is delayed age of marriage, but no. Even taking that into account, there is less marriage at every age in America than from when we first started looking at the statistics. Okay, I'll show you data demonstrating that. Second major element of my model of social capital is work. How do you measure it? Well, there's a question in the General Social Survey, simple but important. How many hours did you work for pay last week? How many hours did you work last week? So what I do is I track that over time. And I developed a term for talking about it in class and in my books. I call it American workaholism. In the year 2000, we, the people of America, officially became the most hardworking folks on the planet. The OECD, an agency of the United Nations, does a survey, and in 2000, we passed the Japanese for the highest average number of work hours per week, men and women. Now that happened in 2000. Since 2000, there has been a substantial increase in work. I'll be showing it to you. And American workaholism doesn't even really cover it because we're getting more workaholic all the time. Democracy in France had failed. Some cat named Napoleon decided to become emperor. That kind of undermined that whole democratic thing. So he comes to America. because we were at that time in 1830, the only working democracy on earth. What was it about America, he wondered, that made us able to have a working democracy? So he went to New York, he went to Boston, he toured small towns in America. He actually distilled an answer. His answer was voluntary association. In less technical language, voluntary association means membership in local community groups. What he saw in America, he had never seen in Europe. He said, Americans are a nation of joiners. They form groups for every rhyme and purpose. So everywhere he went, every little village, Queens, New York, he found groups at the street level, schools, churches, charity groups, fraternal organizations, to an extent non-existent in that old used up continent of Europe. He called us, famous term, a nation of joiners. And he thought that this voluntary group participation was a key element to the beating heart of American democracy. So, in looking at a contemporary model of social capital, it's good to keep an eye on group membership. If you think about where you've lived, you know that communities that have a lot of voluntary association, where people go to church, where people have Boy Scout troops, where there's an active Little League, these tend to be good neighborhoods, places where people want to live. Where you have no voluntary association are generally places that are not so desirable. So it's important to the health of a society to have voluntary association. We'll look at that. Okay, social networks. You may detect a slight uptick in the inflection of my voice. Social networks are my thing, man. This is my special personal and professional interest. I've been studying social networks since I left college in 1972. And what I mean real social networks. I don't mean Facebook. I don't mean Twitter. I mean real face-to-face interaction. When I present this topic, I actually have a whole separate presentation about this. I argue in my class, and I'm saying it to you, the single most important thing in your life in many ways is your social network, is the people in your phone. So we need to look at the baseline data on social networks in America. Okay, I sense the rising need for answers. So let me preface it with one thing here. Over there on the left, I just swelled up again, work and family. The left-hand side of my model, I argue, is the business side. So if somebody in your social network wants to have lunch with you next Thursday, what do? Well, you check and you see, do I have a family responsibility? Do I have a work responsibility? If not, then I can go over to this side here and participate in those forms of social capital. All four of them are my model. Look at those four zones, folks. I argue that we spend 90% of our waking time in one of these four zones, right? You know the expression, get a life? When people say get a life, this is what they mean. Okay? Activate your family ties. Have a career. Participate in community groups. Go out with your friends. This is the essence of American society as you and I live it every day. Time for some real data. Okay, this gives some dimension to what I said at the outset about marriage in America. On the x-axis there at the bottom, I have simply, I'm going to use a technical term, mushed together the general social survey data by decade. So all the surveys from the 70s are in that first vertical line, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s since. What you can see in that track is a decrease in the percentage of Americans married every year. You also see that there is a clear race difference in percentage married. What's eerie, creepy even, is that as both marital rates by race decrease, they remain in parallel fashion. So it's increasing, it's decreasing for both races. Okay, work time. Well, I did a breakdown by sex. What you can clearly see by the rising geometric figures, we've got diamonds for males and rectangles for females, more hours worked every decade. Please notice that in the 70s, there is a yawning chasm between men and women in America, as you may recall. That was the decade when American women started marching into the labor force by the tens of millions. So look at how much the gender gap closes between the 1970s and the 1980s. Also notice that there is a significant increase in work time for men and for women. Not by the way, this is true for every social segment of American society. If you break it down by age, young Americans, middle-aged Americans, and older Americans are all working more than they did in the 90s, more than the 80s, more than the 70s. It's true by race. It's true by region. It's simply true. Americans are working more than ever in every segment of society. Okay, here's the voluntary association thing. How many groups are you a member of? You can see that there's a little bit of a drop off in the 80s, a surge in the 90s, more recently a drop in the 2000s. But you don't have here the cascade that I think Putnam was trying to preview. We are still a nation of joiners. There are international studies comparing rates of voluntary association across the world. We are tied for first with the Swedes, if you must know. There's another measure of voluntary association. Okay, let's get into your social networks, yours and everybody's. Very specific wording, I think it's important for us to think about. By socializing, this is the way they put it in the general social survey. How often do you spend a social evening with, this display shows kin. How often do you spend a social evening? So we're not talking about the cell phone. We're not talking about saying hi to your neighbor in the driveway. Spend a social evening is a real occasion. You might even have to get a sitter to spend a social evening. So we're talking about real face-to-face association. You can see from the 70s to the 80s, well, first of all, you notice, you're not surprised. that women do more kin socializing than men. In every decade, you can see that the pink, yeah, I guess it is pink, is higher than the purple. From the 70s to the 80s, there's a substantial drop in kin socializing, which makes sense. The 70s were the decade when divorce in America skyrocketed. All right, so in that decade, one of the reasons for a precipitous decline in marriage rates was a precipitous increase in divorce. But it stopped there. The reason for the cascade downward of marriage in America is not rising divorce rates anymore. In fact, divorce rates now are lower than they were in the 80s and 90s. Look at the track of kin socializing, spending a social evening. After the 80s, it starts to recover for women immediately. So it pops back up. You see the 90s, it's higher than the 80s, and higher yet in the 2000s. For men, it takes a little bit longer, but after the 90s, there's an increase. Here's the bottom line. Americans are now socializing with their relatives more than they ever have across 50 years. So you can't make a simplistic statement that American society is falling apart everywhere. How about friends? Well, friend socializing is how often do you spend a social evening with friends? It goes up in the 80s, it goes up in the 90s, a little bit of a track down for men, but if you compare the right hand 2000s to the left side 1970s, Americans are spending more face-to-face time with their friends than ever, and a little bit more in each decade. Okay, here's where Putnam caught some partial truth. Neighboring in America. How often do you spend a social evening with neighbors? This is a cascade. This is like you're on a roller coaster, you get to the top, you hit in the 1972 when the GSS started, down it goes. It's significantly decreased for both sexes across the board. Again, everywhere I looked in the data, folks, neighboring in America has crashed. I know that these festivities conclude with you asking me questions. I'm going to be asking you some questions. I'm trying to figure out why neighboring in America is down, down, down. Okay, in addition to looking at people's social involvement in my 4 zones of social capital, I also looked at some of the attitudes that go with it. So, how about marital happiness? General Social Survey asks a simple, direct question. In general, how happy are you with your marriage? And what you see on the screen is the percentage of Americans who say, I'm very happy with my marriage. Well, it was at its highest in the 70s. There's a little bit of a drop across each decade. So the fact that fewer people are getting married, you might think maybe people are being more selective about getting married in the first place, and therefore they'll be happier once they tie the knot. It's not that simple. Something else you can see in these data. In every decade, American men are happier in their marriages than women. You see the purples above the pink in each decade? Yeah, this might be another commentary on how clueless men are, but I'm speculating. Okay, here's another question I'm going to have for you. All right, in addition, when you're looking at how much people are invested in working in terms of hours, a relevant question is, what's their level of job satisfaction? All right, are they doing that because they love their work? Are they doing it because they have to? So the General Social Survey asks a question, in general, how satisfied are you with your job? And on screen is the percentage of Americans who say, I'm very satisfied with my job. Not just satisfied, very satisfied. Folks, the data show, we the people of America, we love our jobs. The percentage doesn't change that much over time, but it hovers right around 70%. So a very high percentage of Americans are very satisfied with their jobs. You'll see that I broke it down by sex. In the 70s, you can't even differentiate the sexes, right? You see, it looks like there's only one geometric figure over there. So about the same percentage of men and women say they're very satisfied with their jobs. As you track over to the right hand, closer to the present, there is, I think, the even more surprising, if not amazing, realization: American women are actually more satisfied with their jobs than men are. Now, on the surface, this makes no sense. Here's another question I have for you. We all know that American women ought to be less satisfied with their jobs, right? You guys know about the gender gap. Women on average are paid about 18% less than men are. And they're often in less occupational prestige positions. By rights, by simple psychology, sociology is a whole different level, this should not be true, but there are the data. American women are at least as satisfied with their jobs compared to men. Okay, trust. The General Social Survey asks, in general, can people be trusted? The percentage saying yes is on screen. It's dropping. All right. In fact, it may even be a little bit misleading. We trust our neighbors. We trust each other less and less and less. To me, one of the most powerful manifestations of this, and I think you folks, given our life stage, will be right there with me. Think about how Halloween has changed over our lifetimes. Halloween. Here was Halloween for little Brian. My brother and I, before Halloween, would go to Wanamaker's. Wanamaker's was a department store in Center City, Philadelphia, and they had wire reinforced bags. We were getting ready for Halloween. We wanted to make a big haul, right? So it's 7 o'clock. That was the earliest my mother would let us out. We would immediately take our wire reinforced candy bags to Revere Street. Revere Street was a row house area. With row houses on Halloween, you could go into mass production, baby. You could go right to each house, to the next house, to the next house. Within 15 minutes, we had filled those bags up, took them home, dumped mine on the dining room table. My brother dumped his on the kitchen table so there wouldn't be any fights. Then we'd run back out. On a good Halloween, we'd load up with 100 candy bars, man. All right, now I don't have to tell you, this is not contemporary Halloween. Last year, I actually kept Halloween statistics because I'm not normal. I have the data sickness. So last Halloween, there were, are you ready? 10 knocks on my door. Only 10. Each time I open the door, displayed before me are 3 or 4 darling costumed children, and lurking, that's the right verb, lurking immediately behind them is a poorly costumed adult checking me out. All right. So emblematic of our lack of trust, I think, is this occasion. Okay. The notion, well, I mean, we all know about these stories about the razor blade and the apple on Halloween. Not, by the way, those stories are all bogus. They are, I think, a reflection of our lack of trust in other folks in our own communities. Okay. I wanted to show you some data looking at education. I do a simple breakdown. You can see in the legend there on the right, the non-college folks are in that color. What would you call that? Vermilion? I don't know. You can see non-college is the darker shade, and college is the pinker shade up above. Over time, the rise of American workaholism has been much greater among Americans who went to college than those who didn't go to college. But please notice that it did rise for both. The previous diagram showed that marriage in America has declined for both college Americans and non-college Americans, but it stopped for Americans who've been to college. So the lack of commitment in marriage is continuing among Americans who haven't been to college, not so for those who have been to college. Over our lifetimes, there has been a massive structural change in America, differentiating those who go to college and those who don't. And it's reflected right here in our social capital. All right, total socializing. I showed you before how often we spend a social evening with relatives, how often we spend a social evening with friends, how often we spend a social evening with neighbors. I added them up. I created an index. I was trying to get an overall measure of how much socializing goes on in America in each decade. You can see here a clear difference depending on whether or not people have been to college. In every decade, college folks do more socializing. Now, this is not people in college during the survey. These are people our age who either went to college or didn't go to college when they were younger. This is another mystery of social capital. What is it about college that makes people more social? Also notice, for those who have been to college, in the upper pinker line, the decline has reversed. So in the 2000s, we're now socializing more than before. The slide has continued, though, for folks who have not been to college. This is fascinating. On the x-axis here, I have how many hours do you typically spend on the internet in a week? How many hours do you typically spend on the internet in a week? As you can see, the popular view that America going to hell in a handbasket has something to do with the computer and people's cell phones, well, no. In fact, the highest level of socializing is among folks who spend 6 to 10 hours a week online. And, if you get away from the talking heads on TV and really think about it, it makes sense. Why do you go online? One of the reasons is you're setting up social occasions. You're setting up a meeting at the PTA. You're setting up a lunch with a friend. All right. So we're not crashing our social capital by using our computers as we are now. Okay. Here I did a further breakdown of education level. Down there on the bottom axis, you can see less than high school. These are people who didn't graduate high school. High school, they have a high school degree, junior college, college, graduate. Look at that. Confidence, I think, is a particularly powerful segment of social capital. The wording in the General Social Survey is, how many people do you have to whom you can discuss important personal matters? How many close friends do you have with whom you can discuss important personal matters? Well, it's eerie, but clear. The more education you got when you were younger, the more warm, supportive confidants you have later on in life. In many ways, here is the bottom line to all of these data. Social capital, I argue, is not only the guts of American society, changing in complex ways, not as simple as bowling alone. But social capital, these are commitments we make to seek the things we value. Happiness increases throughout life depending on how much education you got back then. It's true for every level. Look at that. It creeps up left to right every single time. Now, this presentation could be considered educational, which means soon there will be a small but detectable increase in your happiness because of this presentation. I predict it'll hit you Friday afternoon. Okay. That concludes my little presentation. Thank you for remaining conscious for most of it.
All right, well, that was so interesting. And I'm going to open it up to see if anybody has any, oh, Aurora and Armand. So Aurora, if you want to unmute. Aurora, can you hear us? Okay, Armand, you want to unmute?
By the way, Armand, they warned me about you. It was a good warning.
I'm always full of questions.
As we all should be.
A couple of things that led me to believe that it's dissipating is you go out to eat and you see a family at another table and the kids are on their iPhones, the mother's on her iPhone, dad's on an iPhone. The family essence is not there. And the other thing, going as far as educated and then educated through college, the gatherings and all of that is they make more money. So there's more availability of cash to be able to have get-togethers.
Yeah, pay for dinner.
What's
Yeah.
the feeling on that?
Yeah, the income, Armand, is an issue, but using wizardly statistical analyses, as I sometimes do, if you take out the effect of income, there still is some kind of a pure, weird educational effect. Something about college, something about education fundamentally changes our lifetime relationship to social capital. It just does.
Okay.
Hi, Rose, you want to unmute?
You were discussing the lack of trust in our neighbors and so forth. I've seen that, I mean, but over the last 2 years, especially with the pandemic, people have literally collapsed into their homes. They don't trust anyone. They don't want to go anywhere. They're afraid to.
Yeah,
That has helped with that, I know. But even before that, people like myself, senior, just a couple of years younger than you, we got to the point when we were single that we didn't, you didn't know who to trust anymore. And I'm just wondering, have you seen that?
well, I certainly see it in the data, Rose. I mean, we're not talking about, you're right about the last 2 years, obviously. But I'm tracking a trend that goes back almost 50 years.
Yeah.
And it's not, I mean, people leap to the conclusion that it's because, our lives are more dangerous than ever and crime is a rising tide. And that's not it. Up until the surge in crime in the past 2 years, which I'm sure you've read and heard about, America had been going through a massive, I think largely unexplained, drop in crime. But as the crime line was dropping, the trust line was dropping too. I'm tempted to say, even though I said I'd avoid politics, I'm tempted to say it's the media. People don't think we are less dangerous than we were.
No.
Violent crime rate peaked in 1990. Did you know that?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't know that because they don't hear about it. Let me ask you,
Listen,
what is up with neighboring in America? What happened to neighboring during our lifetimes?
yeah, you used to have block parties and so forth.
Yeah.
And
They were a
everybody
big
got
thing in
together.
Philadelphia. You used to have
Yeah.
block parties. You'd see the police would put out barriers. I don't see it anymore. Do you see it?
No, and the kids used to be outside all playing together. Nowadays, you don't see that.
No.
If the kids are outside, the parents have to be there. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Everything
grew
has
up in a big
everything has to be organized.
Thank you.
Any other theories about the decline of neighboring? I'm all ears.
So I see you, Becky. Aurora, if you want to try again and unmute, we tried that. Let's see if we can get that. And then I see Eileen, I see Marna, and I see Becky. Okay, we're still having a little technical. Go, Eileen, go ahead.
I loved your presentation.
Thank you,
and-
Eileen.
And I love the statement that this presentation is going to make me happy. And
We'll see about that, huh?
right, no, it already did because
Good.
I am a really, really happy person. And I got a job at Temple University in Philadelphia
Ah,
and I needed to get a doctorate and I did. And you
wait,
just
great.
made me really happy that I got that doctorate because that meant I was going to be a happy person my whole life. So
Yeah, on
thank you.
average, not everybody, but on average, true, yeah.
Good.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Becky, go ahead, if you want to unmute.
Yes, he was mentioning that you think that why people don't get together anymore. I believe a lot of it, and this was back even in the 70s. We lived on a lake and a lot of Dallas people were coming in there. Well, I was raised to welcome your neighbor with a cake or whatever, and you take it to them. Well, right quick, you learn, oh, no, you don't do it anymore because these people looked at you. What are you trying to do? Poison us or something?
Really? Wow.
Dallas.
Yeah.
They were from
Now,
Dallas.
listen, I'm from Philadelphia. We are bred to distrust anybody from there. So it
But-
might have to do with that.
Well, too, I think a lot of it is people are working longer hours. Weekend they spend getting ready for work the next week. If
think
they
you're
have
right.
Sunday off, they don't want to go to church because they just want to relax. And that's the reason a lot of this, I believe, the social get-togethers do not happen anymore.
Especially with neighbors. Yeah, I mean, my students come back to campus for reunions. I see them, they say, Dr. Jones, you were right. I'm working 70 to 80 hours a week. So yeah, there's not much time left over.
That's
Uh,
true. And families are the same
Neighborliness.
thing. Families are getting to be the same way. They're working long hours. They don't have time to go see mom or dad because they've got to get ready for the next week.
Yeah, but
And,
oddly, socializing with relatives is higher now than it was when, we were younger. It's surprising.
That's true. You did a
Um,
great job. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Marna, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, I think with cultural diversity over these, I graduated college about a year after you. Correct?
Uh-huh.
And I know that as cities become more populated, there's more diversification in what would be your neighbor. So there's not a homogeneity in culture, religion, background, even from where you were brought up. So people might not relate the same. There's a lot more like apartment buildings. When I moved back from Philadelphia to New York, I lived in a big apartment building. I had no idea who my neighbor was. And like I said, there's not that homogeneity in background. And then
Yeah,
over time, also people move. So whereas core family units used to live by, the parents would take care of kids. Now kids could be living on another coast in another country. I think that's part of it. And also with cultural differences, we do have a lot of people immigrating here. That's how many of us ended up being here. And yet, instead of people stayed within their own pods, now people integrate differently. So I think that has something to do with the fact that people don't feel the need or the desire always to ring a neighbor's bell because they might feel that that neighbor might not have as much in common
Mhm.
as they would under other circumstances. So that also
Actually, that's,
I did want to make a comment. When it came to education and different things, I was surprised when you said that with our working, that we work longer than the Japanese. But I found from years ago, traveling when I was a kid, that the work ethic of the American versus the Japanese and the European was not only horrible, but that their attitudes as students towards academics was not taken the same way. Like I was overseas with kids from different countries, and the Danish and the French kids said, what we do on the high school level, it's far beyond what you guys do. You fool around, you waste time. You don't take it seriously. So that when they graduated from high school, going into college, they were far beyond us in many subjects. And I feel that carries over into the workplace. People who have a crappy attitude towards their academic training, even those who are advanced, when they get into the workplace, they don't have the same work ethic as the kids who take it personally. I mean, seriously. So later on in years, my later years before retiring, I was a pharmaceutical rep with a Swiss company. People from Switzerland, they're no nonsense. And they look at the Americans like they're a joke because we don't.
did they work long hours in
Oh, yeah.
Switzerland?
Well, they also, well, they might have, but they also had longer holidays. They had
Yeah.
a
Oh, yeah.
holiday
Yeah.
period, but the thing is, we might work long hours, but I don't know how much of it we're really working.
Let me pick up that
Ready for
one
their
point.
coffee break and their cigarette break, so that's all.
Yeah, the vacation thing is fascinating. We are not only the hardest workers in the world, we are the worst vacationers on the planet. If you look at the data, the number of vacation days, we in America are dead last with an average of 13. The second worst society at vacationing is Japan with 26. The second worst society consumes twice as many vacation days as we do. This is another aspect of workaholism. You go throughout Europe, as you started to do with Switzerland, The Germans take 39 days of vacation a year compared to our 13, 3 times as many. The Germans. Okay, the Protestant work ethic, nose to the grindstone, grim. We are the worst vacationers in the world. It's another aspect of our workaholism.
Um,
I have a question, Alex.
Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I was gonna say, a lot of the statistics you've shown have been before the pandemic. I think that a lot of those statistics are gonna change after the pandemic. I think
I
the
bet you're right.
workforce, I think people are working from home so much more now, and they're interacting with their families at the same time. There's many, many more people are taking longer vacations. They can go places and work on their computer from Mexico or wherever they want to go. I think the whole society, the data that you have shown is going to be extremely changed in the next 5 years. But I do think the most important thing that people have, 2 things, education and a job. Those 2 things go hand in hand for people's happiness.
I can't disagree with you about either point. As to how the whole work-life balance thing is going to change after COVID, I'll be watching data.
Me too. The other thing I want to mention is before Vietnam, we had a different kind of society. The Vietnam crisis created a distrust of government and government actions.
Well, yeah, some of the other data we didn't get to look at today. If you look at confidence in American institutions, the General Social Survey item asks about the military, the federal government, the courts, all these institutions. That confidence in institutions has been sliding since 1972, which is right in the heart of the Vietnam War. Good point.
So Barbara, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah. There was a study done a couple years ago, and there was a book written about it, and you probably know this. This is about education. They did a study of nuns' brains. They went to a convent, and when the nuns died, they dissected their brains to see if they had the tangles that are indicative of Alzheimer's.
They did.
And they found that the people, the nuns that had more education when they were youthful had, and I suppose they could get education later too, but basically the early education, the more education they had, the less tangles they showed. And what was more remarkable, that some of the nuns' brains had tangles, yet they did not show that in their
They were fine.
behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that the more education recovered some of the physical abnormalities in the brain. So more education, less Alzheimer's.
Yeah, I mean, I'm smiling because I spent about 8 years of my education being disciplined by the nuns. And I read that study. It's fascinating. You're right. They had the fibrillary tangles in the brain, but many of them were functioning very well. And the interpretation is community. In addition to their education, they're also living in a community, tight social bonds and commitments. Appears to be protective, which is another dimension by which activities like this and your linkages to each other are a good thing, man.
Linda, go ahead.
Hi, I just had a question about the questions that you asked. And it seemed like most of the socializing ones were talking about evening gatherings.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that maybe particularly with retired people, but a lot of gatherings and socializations are during the day, like, you know, hiking up a mountain or you hang out with your girlfriend. And there's a lot of connection there. And it seems, did that get missed?
Well, it's the General Social Survey is a big, powerful institution that costs tens of millions of dollars. If you want to insert your own question wording in there, you got to get a grant. So I worked with what I got. You're right. That does limit it. It does specify it. But yeah, I think people who spend social evenings probably spend social afternoons too.
Not necessarily, but okay. I realize that's
Not
just the way it was.
necessarily. Yeah, that's the way they asked it. Yeah, it wasn't my design.
Right, okay.
Rose, go ahead.
Okay, you were talking about the educated versus the uneducated, you know, college and so forth.
Non-college, yeah.
I'm non-college because my parents couldn't afford to send 16 kids to college.
Wow.
And I'm a middle kid, but I can hold my own pretty much with most things because I do a lot of reading, not just plain, you know, novel stuff. I read history. I read other types of, you know, art, all this sort of
Books
thing.
on social capital, I hope.
Some, yes, I do. And people don't know, but I sit here and I take notes off of every single one of our get-togethers.
Wow. you
Every
big nerd.
day.
Yeah.
So that I can go back, and if I have a question about it, I can read it and I can keep it up here in this noggin of mine.
Good.
And
Yeah.
I'm wondering, are there a lot of them out there like me, because I was working 12 hours a day, taking care of my husband because he was ill for 18 years. And then when he died, all of a sudden I had nothing because
Yeah.
I
Happened
was,
to my mom. Yeah.
yeah. So
Well, I mean, part of it's generational, Rose. I mean, back when you and I would have been in college, the percentage of Americans going to college was relatively small. Now it's up over half. And there's an interesting development. There's a change in the gender distribution. Women are taking over college. The percentage of college students who are women now exceeds men, clearly. Women also have higher graduation rates, higher retention rates. As I say to my students, women do their homework.
I worked for the same company for 31 years.
Yeah, it doesn't happen much anymore.
No,
Yeah.
thank you. And it was a great presentation.
Oh, thank you, Rose.
Douglas, I see you have your hand up. Can you unmute? Let's see if Douglas is there. All right, he might have stepped away. So we'll see about that. And I mean, there's Laura had wrote in a bunch of things in the chat. Let's see, the decline in neighboring seems mainly to be the decline in the need to help between neighbors due to specialization and the easy access to specialists. You hire a repair person, you hire an Uber, you no longer think of a neighbor as a helpmate. So also no longer as a potential friend, even friendship is specialized, compartmentalized. Could this have something to do with the decline in neighboring?
Yeah, I think there are elements of it there. I also think it's partially because people are spending so much time at work.
Yeah.
And that doesn't just mean that they're not home to be with their neighbors. It also means, this is going to be one of the things I start to look at next. I think more and more socialization is happening with coworkers. If you're sitting next to somebody for 80 hours a week, it's more natural to strike up a friendship with that person than with somebody you happen to live next door to.
This is Aurora. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Aurora. You
Yes.
got it unmuted.
Hi.
Good. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation, Mr. Jones. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome, Aurora.
Well, when I was looking at it, I rearranged the diagram a bit. I put
Okay.
the person in the center. I put you, I put your plan, your determination. And then around that, I put the work family and all that stuff around that circle. And then on the outside, I put arrows, which meant government, local, state, around that too. Okay, so that gives me a better, clearer way of looking at this. Okay, because the neighborhoods deteriorated because of the homeless situation. Okay, that's another part of it, because you can't have outside gatherings because the homeless people will come in and mess up your activity. Okay, but a lot of stuff thing is about truth. It's about greed, and all those influences there that affects us and how we do daily, and how we do yearly, and how we do our whole lives, you know. And I looked at the plan that I was doing, that would be more helpful to me, because the you and how you determine yourself and what your plans are, and how the other influences and how you react to those other influences determines how your life is going to go, you know. And sadly, it's like the work environment, they took advantage of the people. We're working harder, we're getting less now. I was working in the 80s, I had full benefits and everything, and now they don't do that for the people now.
Hard to get, yeah.
See, and that's the economy problem. Okay, if people had full benefits or socialization, medical, get that off people's backs, that would be helpful. You know, and
Sure.
anything that, you know, those kind of things that would help the family, just like what was the other item that some of the things that'll help, medical is another thing, besides economy wise and get benefits like that. If they took the medical part of it and even make it social, whatever like that, it would take another thing off of people's backs, because, the kids get sick or whatever, they wouldn't have to worry, because they can take them to the doctors and have to worry about, oh, am I going to be able to afford their medicine? Seniors having spent $100 on one medication or more, this is all affects our lives.
This is real life. I love the
Exactly.
fact that you started out saying you would put the individual at the center of my model.
Right.
That's the way I think about it too.
I think so. That's what I was getting from you.
We assemble these boxes according to our own values.
Mhm. And also too, it's the things that we have to keep on reevaluating our lives, because and I'm a senior, and I'm sad to say, I look backwards and think how we believe the Disney model, the fairy tale. We're not even in England. There's no Prince Charming, but if you expect a Prince Charming to happen to you at 60 some years old, there's something wrong here, So that's what I'm saying, that's what I'm saying. You always have to reflect your life. You always have to reevaluate, and that's the whole thing. You can't say like, I can't say like, why aren't they getting the things that they have that I had in the 80s? Why aren't they getting me full benefits? Why are they making it so hard for them to have medical care? Why is life making it so rough for these people? And I could see these people working harder than heck out there trying to make ends meet. And it's like governments, maybe, the haves and have-nots and all the divide and everything like that. But then again, if you look at yourself at the center and start speaking out, and I think, and social networking, and I think that's what women have, is that we learn to connect right off the bat, is connect, and train. That's another part. People are not training the next person over to take care of the next, to take care of the next step. I mean,
I love the fact that you talked about Disney. Disney originally didn't want to build a theme park. He wanted to build a utopia, a perfect society under a dome. The trouble is, he would have had to repeal the Bill of Rights to run it the way he wanted to. So it's a theme park.
Yeah. Bob, go ahead.
Well, talking about Disney, that's a picture of Roy Disney's boat in the background, the one he used in the film Morning Light. I live just down the road from you down in Devon, but I was curious, you talked a little bit about marriage, but I'm wondering how the decline in the total amount of marriage is affecting your socialization data or your thoughts on how that's affecting our socializing.
One of the things I need to look at, Bob, is it could be that the uptick in socializing with kin could be that, previous couples and in-laws are interacting with each other or spending social evenings to compensate. But it's interesting that marriage is down, but interacting with relatives on an everyday basis is up.